Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
What are spiritual experiences? And what do they have to do with evolution? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you on the X-Zone and TV and the X-Zone Broadcast Network. We're produced by REL-MAR McConnell Media Company with studios and corporate offices in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. With us this hour to explore the mysterious realms of spiritual experiences, consciousness, and evolution is Dr. Jonathan ELLERBY. Jonathan is the author of 7 Gateways of Spiritual Experience, Awakening to a Deeper Understanding of Love, Life, and God. A spiritual growth and consciousness expert, his PhD is in comparative religion, focused on indigenous healing traditions and cross-cultural research. He has experienced countless trainings in a wide range of complementary and alternative fields of healing, integrative medicine, and spiritual growth. Jonathan has traveled to meet and study with healers and teachers from more than 40 cultures around the world. His website, jonathanellerby.com. Jonathan, thanks for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this amazing work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. Same to you. So, Jonathan, your bio says you have a PhD in comparative religion. Where did you study?
Well, I actually started my studies in South Africa because I had such an interest in the traditional healing work that still persists in South Africa, a lineage that goes back tens of thousands of years, although I finished it with the Graduate Theological Institute out of Indiana.
Oh, okay, so it's a brick and mortar college.
Yeah, well, it's actually modeled after the European system, which is often research-based. So I was very fortunate to have an extraordinary advisor, a man named Ewart Cousins, who was an esteemed professor of religious studies at Fordham and GTU, as well as listed at Oxford, which was the partner university in my program. So the majority of my work was research-based. So it was field work and of course, back in the day, library work. And that's where the bulk of the material and experience came from for the final dissertation.
So whatever drew you in the first place to Indigenous studies?
Wow, that's a great question to start off with. And you know, I want to acknowledge immediately that it's a complicated topic in today's world, because so many of the traditions and cultures that both spiritual seekers and scientists are needing to reevaluate and reacquaint with and reconnect with are traditions and cultures that have been exploited, that have been diminished, and that in some cases have even been, you know, dealt with in violent ways. So I want to be respectful and say I have been really fortunate to have been enveloped by traditional communities. I have extended family in a community in South Dakota in the United States, and I've spent a tremendous amount of time with Indigenous communities in Southern Africa. Having said that, as someone who was born and raised in Canada in a I guess what I would call generically a white Jewish humanistic home, there's little I could say on behalf of Indigenous people. I certainly would never speak for them. So that's an important preamble probably to a lot of things that may come up in this call. But I can briefly take one more step and say that what I found as a teenager, to be succinct, is that Indigenous communities were some of the only communities that I felt were not just welcoming to the kinds of spiritual experiences that I was having, but also felt sophisticated and really like a kind of home for me. And I'll go on and say that one of the motivations behind the book is that I find that too many people in what we might call the modern Western world have no idea what to do with their spiritual experiences, because even in their religious tradition, there is so much misunderstanding. There is so much social convention that runs against embracing and exploring spiritual experiences, that people are looking for homes for their spiritual lives. They're looking for answers. For me, that happened to have been in the Indigenous world, but I do believe that people today can find it in many places.
So you were having spiritual experiences that kind of drove you to looking. How old were you when you first started having them, and what were they like?
Yes. Well, once again, I'll answer kind of backwards by saying that it's not uncommon that I'll appear in an interview or in an article as sort of an expert with an academic background. But the secret truth you've just sort of driven towards is that I came to that interest in research because these things started happening to me, I would say self-consciously around 10, the age of 10. Now, I will say for the listeners or the viewers, I think everyone's having spiritual experiences all the time. And I think that children are frequently having experiences that we as adults, or even we as researchers, would categorize as spiritual experiences. I think what was distinct for me at that age is that it's sort of the beginning of individuation. Around age 10, 11, 12, we start to question, who am I? What is my place in the world? And I felt that I was dealing with an extra factor that I didn't feel my friends or my family was dealing with. And at the time, it was a distinct perception of energy and a distinctly felt sense of presence. And in some cases, that meant something, vast and grand, like an abiding energy, what some people might call God or consciousness. In other cases, it was something very particular and unique to specific places or specific objects or even specific phenomena. So that's how it all began. And of course, by the time I was a young teen, 13, 14, I started to wonder if I was crazy or if maybe everybody else was. And that's where the more of the, what I call the more formal external search began, wanting to read and understand and interview people to see what exactly was I encountering and were other people having the same experiences.
So, why don't you tell me the anatomy of a spiritual experience?
Ooh, well, that's a fabulous question. And I would say that there's a couple of ways to handle the answer to that question. So first of all, and this has been a part of my work for some time now, I believe that it's helpful to think of spiritual experiences existing on a spectrum. So this is the first thing that I want to identify. And I would say that there are 7 primary types or categories of spiritual experience. And the reason why that's an important part of the answer to your question is that some of these experiences can look very different than others. And so if you have one experience and not another, it's easy to think maybe yours is a spiritual experience, but somebody else's isn't, or the opposite. That, oh, those people are having spiritual experiences because they saw ghosts or they feel energy or they felt that there was a presence when they prayed. But I'm not having spiritual experiences because I'm only experiencing these things over here. So I think understanding that there is a spectrum of types is a first important step or filter to consider. We can certainly talk about those if you want.
So,
But
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, but interestingly, there are some other scholars that have looked at the question, how do we more narrowly define and differentiate a spiritual experience from other experiences? And the first scholar to look at this was William James, an American psychologist who became quite famous actually for a series of lectures he did in Scotland that were transcribed into the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And this has informed psychology and psychiatry until today. Now, Andrew Newberg, a famous neurologist who is known for his clinical and laboratory research on spiritual states, recently, by coincidence, actually came out with a book within a year of mine, one of my recent ones, and his is called The Variety of Spiritual Experiences. In short, both authors and I would agree that there are a few hallmarks, and one is there is a sense that this experience is a departure from ordinary reality. There's a distinct sense that this experience is as real or somehow more real than ordinary reality. There is typically a quality that defies the ordinary perception or senses. So maybe it's more sensorily rich, or it seems to access other senses like intuition or imagination that aren't typically a part of a daily experience. And there is often a feeling of what they call ineffability. In other words, some aspect of the experience just defies explanation, even though it feels more real than anything else, as concrete and practical as anything else. It somehow connects us with something beyond even the mind. And that's really maybe the last hallmark, is it's typically an experience that feels like it's coming as much from the outside in as it is from the inside out. It distinctly feels spontaneous and like almost like what you might call grace, not a product of the mind or something that we have thought of or created.
Well, we're running close to time out in
Yeah.
this segment, but um, is spiritual experience, and we'll get into this much deeper, I'm sure, when we start dancing with shamanism, but is spiritual experience something that one can initiate rather than just wait for the dawn to strike?
Yeah, wonderful experience, or wonderful question. And absolutely. In fact, I'd argue that probably the biggest mistake or detour that religious and spiritual traditions have taken over the years is the focus on belief and the focus on membership and the focus on, power and politics and these sorts of things. If we look back over time and around the world, what we see is that most spiritual practices, from yoga to meditation, prayer to dance, that all of these things were originally cultivated to facilitate spiritual experiences. So yes, anyone can have a spiritual experience, and I believe we are having them all the time.
Real briefly, um, what is in common with the methods of accessing spiritual experience? I mean, it's been around forever, yes.
Right.
Do they have some things in common?
Well, yes and no, actually. So this is something else that I've certainly written about. And I, at one point in my career, was really interested in finding out what is that very specific formula. Is there one sort of archetype or architecture that we see? And actually, what I found was something that surprised me, which is that there are, I would say, really 4 different doorways into cultivating spiritual experiences.
Well,
Someone,
we're going to have to leave it as a cliffhanger and
cliffhanger.
look at those 4 on the other side of a station break.
All right.
Jonathan and I will return shortly, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Have you had a spiritual experience? With us this hour discussing spiritual encounters is Jonathan Elderby. Jonathan is the author of 7 Gateways of Spiritual Experience, Awakening to a Deeper Understanding of Love, Life, and God. Jonathan, we left a cliffhanger, and that was we were trying to find out about the 4 ways to initiate spiritual experiences. Would you continue?
Absolutely. So the story, and I'll try to keep it very brief, but the story was that I was in the middle of researching this exact question. And at the time, I had this feeling or hypothesis that there would be certain universal mechanisms, and that maybe if I sat long enough with enough practices and compared Qigong with Tai Chi and yoga and meditation and reciting mantras and chanting and so on, that at some point I would be able to reveal qualitatively that there is a simple architecture to it. And in fact, what I found is I sort of almost literally separated the categories of experience and types of practices, that I could not reduce it beyond 4 basic types. So what we find is that there are types that are very mind-oriented. And so they involve a kind of hyper focus of the mind. And that would be things like prayer, meditation, or sacred study. And for people who can essentially lose themselves in mental practice, that can open to spiritual experience. But there are those of us that are more emotionally rooted. If there's no love, if there's no relatedness, that stuff doesn't matter. And probably it's not going to open much. So those people need things more like devotional practices, working with a guru or a mentor, or even something like service. So there needs to be an exchange. And when that heart opening occurs, they access spiritual experiences. Of course, there's others that are more physically oriented, and they're picking things like yoga and ecstatic dance and qigong and ceremony and music. And again, these are the ways that they are able to displace the self, open the mind, connect with the heart, and that becomes their gateway. The last category I call the spiritually oriented, which seems redundant, but these are things where we're really stripping beyond the ordinary life. So those would be things like practices around death and dying, somewhat extreme, ascetic practices like extremes of fasting from light or food or human contact. And then the most rigorous practice of all is the one that I think most people would like to say that they're engaged with, but it's certainly the hardest. That's the life practice. And that's where we make every single moment, without exception, the cultivating of relationship with something greater. If I could summarize what they have in common that they're pulling us towards, is typically a quieting of the mind, an opening of the heart, and a kind of movement into extreme present moment awareness. And when those things happen, I would argue spiritual experiences can happen for you pretty much every day.
So, how do indigenous healing traditions apply in our modern world?
What I found in my own experience, and in not only experiencing traditional healing methods and working with teachers and observing their work, is I find that they not only do they have the capacity, like any healing tradition, like Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or Western medicine, not only do they have the capacity to address healing needs and provide therapeutic interventions, but I think what's most significant is that their mindset and methodology stand for something that Western medicine has lost. Indigenous medicine is very much about the whole person. It is not what we call allopathic, which means symptom focused. It's typically looking at the root cause of things, and it always integrates the whole person, which means that even if it's something as simple as a headache or a digestive issue, it would never be as simple as, here's the plant we prescribed for this, right? It's never that transactional or reductionistic. In fact, I remember spending a lot of time with one Anishinaabe traditional healer in Manitoba, Canada. And I used to sit with him while he was doing his work. And people would come, kind of just like a regular doctor, one after the other throughout the day, and they'd sit with him. And I noticed that even though he was prescribing herbal medicine, so we're not talking about spiritual issues, just plain ordinary physical stuff, I noticed that while the herbal, you might say, concoctions or remedies that he was prescribing may have had some similar plants, they also had different plants in them. And I asked him about that once. And I'm fortunate because very often traditional healers aren't fans of questions or giving away these kinds of answers because it's too simple, too reductionistic. But he pointed out essentially how complex and complicated each person is. So two people may have a headache, and one person is somewhat connected to their anxiety. Another person's may be connected to their digestion. Another person's may be connected to their sleep. So even though the ultimate symptom is the same, the root could be very different, and therefore the treatment should be different. Very often, prayer, connection to the spirit world, and some sort of invigoration of the relationship with self and community was also part of the medicine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what was your main takeaway from studying with these healers from more than 40 cultures?
Well, in some ways, I'd say, these things that I've just summarized are some of the important things I would encourage people to remember, especially if they're on any kind of a healing journey, whether it's dealing with anxiety, addiction, chronic illness or even something acute and they've gone into the hospital for a surgery. I think remembering the importance of nurturing the whole self is critical, of finding the balance between authenticity and nurturing your individuality in relationship to community and building connection. Those are all critical. But maybe more than that, if I were to point to one thing that really stands out, I think it's the loss of worldview. And that may sound really grand, but I have come to believe that by becoming overly focused on the material world, on the scientific method, on the world of commerce and power, our dominant Western culture has become what I consider to be extremely, extremely masculine in its style and nature and focus. This leads to the consciousness of conquest and colonialism, which sounds like an old story, but it's not, because this is what we're seeing big tech companies doing, and this is what we're seeing the big billionaires doing. It's still a consciousness of conquest and competition rather than collaboration and innovation and creativity. And I think when we look at the issues in the world today and the kind of solutions we're going to need for our future, I'd say that Indigenous mindset, which is so communal, so pluralistic or inclusive and integrative of diverse views, I think it's going to be absolutely essential to help us all go forward in a healthy and balanced way.
Well, there's a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for years, but it has to do with appropriation of ceremony. Where do you stand on that?
I think the complicated thing is that we try to look at this in from a universal perspective. And what some people might say is, well, if yoga can be used, and that came from India, why can't, indigenous practices be used? And I'd say there's a couple of reasons why that stands out as different. The first, of course, is just colonial history. And if you have the close approximation of two parties in which one has been dealt with violently and they are still there, then it is, I would say, the responsibility of the party that is not, in the community that has been subject to the, whatever you would call it, persecution or genocide or cultural deconstruction, to show respect. And I think that is important because that in itself is a healing lesson. So I don't think we're losing something just because we respect when one tradition, community, or culture says, hey, leave that to us. I'd say if a community says, leave it alone, you just leave it alone. I would certainly like that if someone came and hung out in my house and they started touching stuff. On the other hand, can we learn from these traditions and reclaim old versions of these things from our own ancestry? And I believe, yes, I think there's ample evidence for example, shamanic practices in, well, all over the world. We find it in the United Kingdom, a long history of shamanism. We find even in the Jewish tradition, a history of shamanism. We find it in Eastern Europe and South America. So I think people just need to be a little more creative when they feel like they want something in an indigenous culture, but they don't know if they're entitled to it. Probably that's a sign you don't. So take a look at your ancestry and take a look at the modern innovations that are creating global and universal access to earth-based traditions and spiritual connection. I think there's a lot of wonderful options that don't require appropriation.
Well, we're also fast food country, right?
Yes.
Do you see that fast food, fast fix mindset corrupting and watering down the practices?
I think you hit something really, really significant, which is, why don't people look beyond just appropriating what's easy and close? Because they want a quick fix. They want it to be easy. They want to do it the way they want to do it. And they're not used to getting no for an answer. In traditional cultures, spiritual growth and wisdom is thought of as something that you earn, not something you learn, which means it doesn't matter if it's available on the internet. You take time to acquire it. And we're not used to that. And I would also argue that some of the deepest spiritual work I've ever done or been introduced to, it's typically hard work. And while remarkable things can happen in a quantum instant, there's often a lot of preparation and cultivation and disappointment along the way. And strangely, I'd say I've learned as much about time and disappointment and unlearning the fast food culture from spiritual experience as I have learned that, yes, it is also true that spiritual experiences can catapult us into a whole new way of being or a radical healing in just a matter of moments.
So we're just virtually out of time here, but there's initiation and embodiment involved in a lot of the preparation for a spiritual experience. Do you find that necessary?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, a simple way to frame that is to say that we are not psychologically built to grow and advance and transform in an instant. So even if we have a radical insight or we're ready for a radical change, it's important psychologically and physiologically to allow ourselves a process of formation and development and integration. And really, that's even true if you start a new job, if you end a relationship, if you lose a loved one, or you graduate from a program. There is a process of development, as you said,
Well,
initiation, integration that's necessary.
it's time for another station break. Jonathan and I will be right back to continue our discussion. So stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Can Indigenous healing traditions help us understand spirituality? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. Our guest this hour is Jonathan Ellerby. His website, jonathanellerby.com. Jonathan, in a lot of different traditions, at least to my understanding, there's a link between physical health and balance and the ability to access spiritual information. Do the indigenous cultures, their healing practice, does it align with, support the spiritual experiences as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, in case people are just joining, I don't pretend to represent Indigenous traditions in any way. I can only speak to my experience over the last 35 years. And I'd say, yes, absolutely. I'd say absolutely virtually any experience of healing in traditional cultures typically invites a complementary, you might say, metaphysical component to any physical component. So that would be to explore the meaning behind an illness or the timing of an illness, or to seek or ask for help from the spiritual world in dealing with virtually any kind of illness, and even to cultivate a relationship to the spiritual dimensions of the medicine you're receiving, even if it's chemotherapy. So I would say that there is virtually always a psychosocial dimension in Indigenous healing. I will also qualify by saying that this varies around the world, though. In North America, for example, I believe that the Indigenous communities have much more exposure to the language and style of communication that we find in psychology and in addiction treatment. So a lot of the healing work that is done in Indigenous communities will utilize those filters or frameworks. When I spend time in more remote communities in Africa, for example, in Southern Africa, we see less of that, much less of that, although there is still always an invitation to the spirit world to be involved in any healing process.
Understandably so. Do you see a lot of feedback, spiritual feedback? In other words, you're inviting the spirit of the situation to inform us, to guide us, to help bring balance. Do you see a lot of the feedback from spirit used in Indigenous healing?
Oh, yes, I think, and I know you have such a wealth of experience yourself. I'd say that's absolutely one of the distinguishing features of Indigenous healing practices, which is that there is rarely an assumption, quite opposite to the Western model. There is rarely an assumption within any healer that they have all the answers, that they are in total control, or that they have all the medicine necessary. So it is virtually always an element of a traditional approach to invite spiritual guidance, intuition, and relationship to be a part of evolving a very unique approach to each situation. Absolutely.
Our poor doctors could use that reassurance, couldn't they? That they have somebody on their shoulder that's going to fill in the blanks where they come up empty.
Yeah, and you know what I find interesting, the more I look at this and the more I'm in dialogue with Western practitioners, is that I think we've created a cultural story. Some people say a narrative that Western medicine is entirely evidence-based and doctors are all about control. But the reality is, I think spirituality is something that is non-negotiable in this world. And the only thing that varies from culture to culture is how much it's suppressed or repressed and the language we use. But let's face it, at the end of the day, every physician needs to make a judgment call or use clinical acumen, which is really just fancy language for intuition based on the circumstance.
So, how can spiritual experience help people who are facing personal struggles or mental health issues? I mean, if
Yeah.
they're already having mental health issues, a spiritual experience might be a little challenging.
Yeah, that's an important question because there are some cases where a mental health issue or episode can be exacerbated by spiritual experience. Although generally speaking, what we find is that may not be a spiritual experience. That may be more of a manic episode or a psychotic break or something like that. Those typically look and feel differently, and even your what I would call your average psychologist or psychiatrist or Western practitioner, typically they have a sense when something is essentially indicative of an unhealthy process, as opposed to just something weird that they don't believe in, right? So feeling that you were visited by an angel during a dream and that it offered a healing blessing is very, and this may sound a little bit exaggerated, but it's different than someone who says that they've been watching TV and that God is speaking to them through the characters and asking them to harm all the other patients on the unit. Like those are very different experiences. And actually, I've dealt with both of those in hospital settings. Um, Having said that, there are profound benefits to cultivating spiritual experience for people dealing with health and mental health issues. And we know this because, for example, the addiction field, for a long time has been based on spiritual principles and values. And we even know through clinical research that psychologists and psychiatrists will attest that very often it's not until someone has a spiritual experience that they are really ready to awaken to something greater in themselves and in their lives. In a similar way, whether dealing with anxiety or depression, spiritual experience allows us to depart briefly, or maybe if we're lucky for a little bit longer, the constructs of a narrow episode that is limiting our view of who we are, of what's possible. Typically, a mental health crisis involves feeling stuck in something we cannot control. There's typically shame and fear baked into that. And when we have spiritual experiences, regardless of how long or how deep they are, they lift us out of those symptoms and allow us to see ourselves differently, to know our place in the world differently, and to feel the possibility of healing and change. And very often, those simple things alone are enough to help people to make a significant step or even to alleviate symptoms in itself.
We're living in some pretty interesting times. And, there's crises all around us. I mean, we can say, yeah, it's always been that way in history, but right now it's pretty intense.
Mhm.
And the children that are coming on deck are going to be confronted with things that we never even dreamed of. Is there some way spiritual experience can be used by parents
Mm.
towards children, or how do they address it when a child comes up with one? Would you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really beautiful question because the sort of irony that we're running into is that it seems that the more and more the world moves to massive scales of crisis. And you're right, we may have always had problems in the past, but the scale of these problems is now different, right? Because one leader doesn't just affect 1,000 people or 10,000 people, they can affect 10 million or 100 million people. So while the world seems to be narrowing in many ways, not entirely, because there's clearly a global evolution underway, at the same time, it does appear that children are arriving more and more sensitive, more and more open, and parents are caught between these two dynamics. The most important thing a parent can do for a child that seems to be exhibiting spiritual interests or experience is simply to be supportive, to help them to feel that it's safe, it's okay, it's normal, and even to be curious so as to invite the further exploration of those things. What we find is that while you can read all kinds of books, and I recommend that, exercises to do with your kids and practices and so on, any spiritual practice could be shared with a child. The most important thing is simply not to shame them, not to challenge them, not to doubt them, but to be curious, loving, supportive, as really you could and should with any aptitude of any child.
So now, children, for the most part, imagination is still alive and well. What does imagination have to do with spiritual experience?
Yes, wasn't that a brilliant, important question? There is a very strong connection between imagination and spiritual experience because in many ways, spiritual experience takes place within the same landscape, or you might say using the same mechanisms that imagination uses. And yet it remains distinct. So you might think of it as like imagination is one sport. And if you are a really good swimmer and you do lots of swimming exercise all the time, it will support you when you move to, I don't know, baseball or gymnastics or some other sport. So there's a certain kind of muscle involved, and I'm speaking metaphorically, in imagination that is absolutely a precursor or a stage that spiritual experience springs out of. When we look at, for example, shamanic journey work, guided imagery, hypnosis, even energy healing and energy medicine, virtually all of these types of sort of spiritually rooted healing traditions rely on the visionary mind. So to have access to one's imagination is to have access to one's intuition, to one's creativity, and we become more permeable or open to spiritual, you might say, forces or wisdom or insight to come in. It's absolutely essential. Such an important question.
So does building something in imagination consciously, does that impact what's going to go on at the quantum level, say for instance?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, and I know that many of your guests have addressed this, and I think it's one of the important contributions that your show makes, which is that it's to remind people that over the last, arguably 1,500 years, we have been refining and refining a model of reality that is divisive, and a word that I use a lot is reductionistic, as if the world is the sum of its parts. But what we know through spiritual tradition and good modern science is that that could be anything, there couldn't be anything further from the truth. The world is an emergent principle that comes together as something greater than the sum of the parts, and that all of the parts are interconnected and they are communicating with each other. We know this is the way of a forest. We know this is the way of a family. We know this is the way of the cells and the biology in the body. We now know that the mind or the intellect is not just in the brain, but that thinking happens at every level. And so this pattern of interconnection is happening at all levels of our reality. Therefore, yes, our thoughts and our emotions are absolutely communicating, not only with our body, not only with our energy body, but with everyone and everything around us.
That certainly opens our eyes as to what kind of impact we have even when we don't know it. It is time for yet another station break. Please stay with us as Jonathan and I continue to explore the impact of spiritual experiences. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Can spiritual experiences help us evolve? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Jonathan ELLERBY. His website, jonathanelderby.com. So, Jonathan, that's the question of the day. Can spiritual experiences help us evolve, and if so, how?
I think spiritual experiences are actually one of the most important missing ingredients to the kind of evolution that I would say most of your viewers and listeners are looking for. And I would even argue that we are hungry for in this world. And the reason why they're so essential, as opposed to so many other forms of growth or evolution, is because they have the capacity to introduce a level of novelty that is absolutely essential in the most dramatic forms of evolution. In other words, if our growth and healing as individuals, families, communities, cultures, or as humanity is simply built on the sum total of lessons from the past, then we're going to find it difficult to make much progress because we're using a mindset that's not working to evaluate mindsets that haven't worked and things that have failed in the past in order to somehow co-create a future that we've never even seen. And yet what we know is that some of the most incredible innovations and insights from the physics of Einstein to the music of the Beatles has come to people through spiritual experiences. That means aha moments and insights that quite literally transcend what we feel we know, who we think we are, and what we may be in the middle of. So the greatest capacity for transformative healing and evolution absolutely resides in the spiritual experience. And I'd say we have evidence. This is what's been going on for 60,000 years of human culture.
It's interesting. I think to support what you just said, there's a thing called cultural base. Okay, if you study sociology, and what it is different cultures that aren't even necessarily in communication with each other will develop the same thing at the same time. So when Ford developed the vehicle here, it was also being developed elsewhere. And it's not like there was a space race to do it. It just happened, kind of like the 100th monkey theory. So how does that relate to spiritual experiences and the ahas we're talking about?
Another such a brilliant question, because what you're pointing us towards is challenging some of our assumptions of reality. For a lot of people that are looking at spiritual experience, whether they like it or not, their cultural orientation is psychological, it's mechanistic, and the idea is that somehow, even though yes, they're important and meaningful, it's all coming from us. We are psychologically creating the spiritual experience. But what you're pointing us towards is a very different possibility. What Carl Jung would suggest, and certainly shamans, traditional healers, and mystics for thousands of years have known this, is that spiritual experiences may be much more about accessing ideas, energy, information, even emotions that exist in another dimension. Now, some could call that the quantum realm, and some might call that the cosmic realm. And I don't really care what you call it, but what I certainly feel strongly about that I think you're pointing towards is that we are drawing from a reservoir that is not only within the human experience, but beyond it. And when human beings open themselves to that reservoir, that source, that mystery, that consciousness, well, then they will pull in similar tenets and principles, which is why we see so much cohesion in the spiritual, psychological, and metaphysical work around the world. It may be coming through different filters, different people, different times, and different cultures, but there are certain superstructures to our universe and our consciousness that will persist again and again in any discipline and in any life.
So if we're able to develop a discipline from whatever aligns with us personally, whereby we can access this esoteric information, if you will, how can we tell that we're channeling or we're just validating what we're saying by calling it channeling? How can you tell the difference?
So there's a few things that I think are worth considering on this topic. The first is that, and this may seem a little intellectual, but we have to accept that at some level, all reality is what we could call perceptive, meaning with the exception of the material world, which we could measure and arguably generally agree with, right? This is 3 inches long and this weighs 5 pounds and simple things like that. When it comes to just about everything that we experience internally, there is a certain level of filter and subjectivity. To that end, I would say we have to consider what feels truthful. We have to consider what feels aligned. And if nothing else, I would always argue, let's see what works. So if I receive channeled information myself or through someone else, and it helps bring cohesion, healing, peace, goodness to my life and the world around me, I don't really personally care too much if someone explains that as literally a being sending information or a person accessing a broad reservoir of information, or somehow they just connect with a higher self that has the knowledge. I think to some level, any of our interpretations will have an element of truth and an element of mystery. What's important to me is that we feel truthfulness, we feel grounded, we feel centered in these spiritual experiences, and they work. They bring us into alignment with life, and that's all the evidence I need to continue pursuing something.
In many traditional indigenous cultures, when seeking spiritual experience, it involves shattering of the individual,
Mm.
whether through fasting or being buried up to your neck, or there were some pretty severe ones, I think, in a lot of the different cultures. What's the purpose of shattering the individual and to access spiritual information?
Yeah, so first of all, I think you point out that Indigenous communities today remain important reservoirs of these kinds of practices and information, and they have virtually never let them go. On the other hand, it is also important to say that all of our cultures and all of our traditions all over the planet have embraced this principle you're talking about, which is that a deeper integration of a new evolution involves a disintegration of a former state. Of course, the cliche, although very appropriate metaphor, is the butterfly. And I think many of us forget the true profundity of that image, because a caterpillar doesn't just climb into a little sleeping bag and sprout wings. It dissolves completely. There is virtually nothing left of its former state, and yet all the same matter then enriched becomes something new. In the same way, we see around the world and throughout time the significance of ego death, identity death, and the experience of releasing a mindset or worldview in order to embrace and integrate a new one. As long as we cling to what we think we know or who we think we are, there will never be room for what we are capable of and what we have not yet become.
Looks like we're going through a mass collective death of the soul at the moment, but
I
yeah.
would
So
say, well, and you know, what you're bringing up is very important for people to hear, because in a worldview that doesn't understand that breakdown is necessary for breakthrough, they can see all this upheaval and discomfort and feel fear rather than encouragement. And for example, when I see my 15-year-old son struggling with self-discipline or learning or following through on commitments, instead of retreating into the fear of making him uncomfortable, I can feel excited that this is the evidence that he's growing beyond being a child. And the same thing happens to us at all stages of life. It's important to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
so it's that time in the show, Jonathan, when I have to ask you, what's your mission?
Hmm. Well, I don't want to steal or appropriate, but I think you and I might have the same mission. My mission is to do everything I can in my lifetime to facilitate, support, and accelerate the evolution of consciousness. So all the work I've done throughout my life has been about transformation. And regardless of the mechanism or the community or the mode, I would say mindset, worldview, or what we could broadly call consciousness is at the heart of it all.
Very, very nice mission there. So, how has the study of spiritual experiences impacted your life, and how do you see it impacting us as a whole?
You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about this just today, and I want to be vulnerable and quite honest about this. I have had some moments as an adult where I've wondered, did these spiritual experiences, and you may know I've written about some pretty dramatic things that have happened to me. Like, do they really help me when I'm struggling with my children or frustrated in my marriage or something's not going well in my job? What I'm reminded is that I don't believe that spiritual experience and evolution means that everything's always going to be perfect for us. I think what has happened for me is it's developed a kind of mental agility and emotional resilience so that I can be observing, I can access peace, and I can be curious in the middle of an internal storm, in the middle of a situational storm. And that is probably the greatest gift, right? To always know, no matter what I go through, that there's more to me than what's going on, and there's more to the world than what I see. And in a similar way, I would say the gifts for the world are something similar, although I would push and say that some of the key hallmarks of spiritual experience are the felt sense of interconnection, the humility of touching mystery, and the direct encounter of a kind of loving impulse to heal, to serve, to care for, to steward that I think our world needs today. Spiritual experiences are about rising above the me and integrating the we. And I think that when we move into that conscious connection with a loving impulse to serve through a humble intention to learn, there is nothing we cannot heal, there is nothing we cannot transform, and certainly a beautiful, vibrant future awaits.
Well, that's a beautiful way to close because it is the end of our time together. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, and thank you for the incredible work that you're doing. It's important, and I'm happy to be a very small part of it.
Thank you. Our guest this hour has been Jonathan ELLERBY, the author of The Seven Gateways of Spiritual Experience, Awakening to a Deeper Understanding of Love, Life, and God. To find out more about Jonathan, where you can find his books and other offerings, visit his website, jonathanellerby.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But most importantly, please be sure to join us right here next time as this mission continues, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.